Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 27th week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. For almost 30 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of the program are available at archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been running sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Close quote. This is a Eurasia or Their Asia edition of News from Neptune. The upcoming summit meeting in Helsinki between President Trump and Russian President Putin will highlight the political engagement of a relatively declining American empire and the growing economic integration of Eurasia, which the U.S. ruling class has seen as the greatest threat to its profits for more than a century. The real fight, however, is within the U.S. political establishment, which has seen Trump as a threat to its generation-long attempts to keep Russia and China down with economic pressure and threats of war. The Australian journalist and filmmaker John Pilger wrote before the election, "The CIA has demanded Trump not be elected. Pentagon generals have demanded he not be elected. The pro-war New York Times, taking a breather from its relentless low-rent Putin smears, demands that he not be elected. Something is up. These tribunes of perpetual war are terrified that the multi-billion-dollar business of war, by which the United States maintains its dominance, will be undermined if Trump does a deal with Russian President Putin, then with China's President Xi Jinping. Their panic at the possibility of the world's great power talking peace, however unlikely, would be the blackest farce were the issues not so dire." Close quote. Of course, Trump in office has been largely tame to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of the last administration, policies that produced more war and more inequality and elected Trump. But to the U.S. ruling class, Trump is a constant threat to those policies. The hysterical and dangerous Russiagate campaign against Trump, adopted even by the new Democratic star, Ocasio-Cortez, shows the political establishment's need to get the presidency back into a safe pair of hands, safe for their profits. The U.S. populace, on the contrary, must demand that the 1,000 U.S. military bases ringing Russia and China be closed. Russia has a dozen, China has one. U.S. troops and weapons be brought home, and social support, including free medical care, education, and a universal basic income, be provided for Americans immiserated by generations of U.S. government wars. You're watching News from Neptune, and we'll begin with David Green.
Well, we had, speaking of wars and fomenting war, the News Gazette is trying to foment a rebellion in Iran this morning, hoping that the people will overthrow their government, which wants to wipe Israel off the map and all that kind of stuff. And so that's just one local example of that sort of thing going on. There's a lot. We had a distinguished visitor this past Saturday on the whatever day that was, June 30th. Medea Benjamin of Code Pink spoke eloquently about Iran at the McKinley Presbyterian Church, and I thought it was a very beneficial event attended by about 30 people or so, and was informed also by some, especially one Iranian woman in the audience, whose name I don't know, and a couple of our other Iranian friends were there too, as well as others. Where to go with what this we We endured this July 4th holiday. Kind of interesting to see an article in the News Gazette about the float, the Gold Star float in that parade. They did an interview with a mother, with a gold, I think what you would call a Gold Star mother, similar to, then very different than Cindy Sheehan from the Iraq War days, although we're still in that war. This woman had lost her son, and it was curious because it said in the article that her son had died in Kuwait in 2003. And I was wondering, how did he die there in 2003? And as it turned out, when our troops were shipped over there in 2003, prior or during or after we invaded Iraq in 2003, this woman's son had died of some kind of breathing difficulties in Kuwait, as had 8 or 9 other service persons at that time. And in fact, the News Gazette had covered it at that time. They had covered her concerns with how her son had died because she hadn't got any straight answers from the military or government on how that happened. And as far as I can tell from just doing a little Googling and reading the articles from back then, there never was any satisfaction or any satisfactory reason as to why they died. And so it just struck me, without wanting to make this in any way personal, it struck me as being rather strange that this bereaved mother was choosing for the last 15 years to put her energy into the sort of promoting the idea of honoring people for their service, as opposed to questioning the government as to why they were in service in the first place. So I just wanted to drop that little note. Had you noticed that at all?
No, I do think that that's the problem in the way in which the service is used for propaganda purposes. The late George Carlin used to say, service is a strange word for killing people. And while we look at the people who have been sent, particularly to the Middle East, and there are thousands and thousands of them, in spite of the fact that most Americans don't know it, for the war purposes of the United States, we look on these people as heroes. We're encouraged to look on these people as heroes. In fact, most of them have done it for a variety of motives, including the lack of other jobs. So, I mean, the people who've been killed in the Middle East, the Americans who've been killed in the Middle East, have to be ascribed to American policy, not to anything else. And it seems to me that the efforts of the government to make sure that that policy isn't questioned, the effects of it aren't even known, is not an accident. That was one of the geniuses, if you like, of the last administration, to make sure that what was actually going on, the way in which the U.S. was conducting vicious war, particularly throughout the Middle East, but indeed in other places around the world, didn't get into the national consciousness. In this enterprise, they had a lot of help from mainstream media, but they were also very good at it themselves. That was Obama's grace, so to speak.
Yeah. So you raise issues regarding the ruling elite and the relationship with Donald Trump, who is the top dog, allegedly the top dog in this ruling elite. And just because of some stuff, you may end up hating me for this, but just because of some stuff that I've been listening to and reading about in the last week, I want to see if I can try to place this intra-ruling class conflict in some theoretical context. I've been listening to some podcasts on something called the Dead Pundit Society, and in particular, which is run by a guy named Adam Proctor, a very good podcast. And he's been doing a series of shows, or repeating a series of shows, actually, on state theory. And he did a long 2-hour show with a young scholar named Raphael Khachaturian about the Miliband-Poulantzas debate mostly centered in Britain and other in European context in the late 60s and early 70s. And I was wondering if you would indulge me by exploring this idea of what the state is and how the state acts and what we can do to change the state's behavior, including obviously in relation to war. So this will take like 3 minutes or so to read.
I think it's enough time to devote to the state, sure.
Yeah, and it is of a theoretical nature, and I know it's probably not going to be difficult for people who have never heard of this, but let's see if we can boil it down.
One comment to begin, David.
Yeah.
There's always a problem in talking politics in America with the use of the word state.
Right.
For most Americans, that means one of the political divisions, one of the 48 political divisions of the the United States.
Yeah. Of course.
And particularly in an English context or in a European context, which you're talking about right now, the state refers to what Americans normally would say as the government. Now, there's not exactly an equation there because it depends upon the various natures of states and governments. But we should say that in order to make sense of what you're talking about here, we should remember this American confusion between state and government. You're talking about government.
Yeah.
You're talking about governments present and past, and the way in which they work, which is summarized with the term state. Right?
Yeah, and to put it in Marxian phrases, because this is a debate within Marxism.
For all our Marxist listeners.
The state, for all two of them, the state is the executive committee of all the bourgeoisie. Sometimes when people say that, they forget the all of the bourgeoisie, but it's all of the bourgeoisie, and therein lies the rub. How does the state represent all of the bourgeoisie? So let's think about that in terms of Donald Trump and his relationship with the rest of the ruling class, Republican, Democrat, Wall Street, oil man, otherwise. The Miliband-Poulantzas debate was a debate between Marxist theorists Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas concerning the nature of the state. Their exchange was published in New Left Review, beginning with Poulantzas' review of Miliband's 1969 publication on bourgeois democracies. The State in Capitalist Society was the name of that famous book. In their exchange, Miliband argues for the instrumentalist, keyword, model of the capitalist state, whereas Poulantzas takes a structural position, or structuralist, another keyword. In The State in Capitalist Society, Miliband puts forth his theory of how the state functions to serve capitalist interests. It does so, he claims, because of 1, the social origins of members of state government, and 2, the personal ties and influence between members of state government and ruling class elites. This might also, let me say parenthetically, be called an institutional analysis, one that pretty much Chomsky makes in his media criticism and so forth. Poulantzas disagrees with Miliband's approach, adopting a structural position. He claims the state is objectively a capitalist entity. Again, the state is objectively a capitalist entity, which can serve no purpose other than preserving the capitalist mode of production. Furthermore, Poulantzas, argues that if members of the ruling class are the same people as those who manage the state, this is merely a coincidence. The state reproduces capitalist relations regardless of who is in charge. In Poulantzas' critique, he claims, quote, the relation between the bourgeois class and the state is an objective relation. There's that word objective again. This means that if the function of the state in a determinate social formation and the interests of the dominant class coincide, it is by reason of the system itself. The direct participation of the members of the ruling class in the state apparatus is not the cause, but the effect. End quote. And then just 2 more brief paragraphs here. In a response to Poulantzas's criticisms, Miliband counters that Poulantzas's position allows no room for agency, another key word in this discourse, and is therefore too limiting. His point of view does not allow individuals to make decisions based on their own free will. Rather, their decisions are determined solely by the structure of society. Again, Miliband, and then this last quote is from Miliband, in response to Poulantzas's criticism of his instrumentalist view. Poulantzas exclusive stress on objective relations suggests is that what the state does is in every particular and at all times wholly determined by these objective relations. In other words, that the structural constraints of the system are so absolutely compelling as to turn those who run the state into the merest functionaries and executants of policies imposed upon them by, quote unquote, within Miliband's quote, the system. And I guess what this raises, just to put a little point on this, is that Obama came into power voted for by many people who thought that he could challenge power. But Obama's gift was to assure power, the ruling class, that he was not going to get out of line in any way, shape, or form. Jeffrey St. Clair on his Counterpunch column this morning makes the relevant comment that when Obama appointed Timothy Geithner from Goldman Sachs to be Treasury Secretary, he completely assured the ruling class and quashed any chance that he might have to actually challenge that ruling class. That was a strong signal. So contrast this irony of Obama, the outsider, as the consummate insider, versus Trump, who is the insider become an outsider, and he's riling up the ruling class. But from the Milibandian perspective, it makes no sense because he's part of the ruling class, and from the Poulantsian point of view, it makes no sense because he's part of the ruling class, and even as part, whether he's part of it or not, the ruling class is gonna dominate whoever is in power. Now, I don't think Poulantzas necessarily intended to say that there is no hope. There is no hope for change, or maybe he was saying that there is no hope except sort of a very bottom-up kind of movement.
Complete transformation.
Against capitalism, against war. Right. And the question becomes, I guess, in the context of war, the question becomes, I think, just one more comment, is that on the left, quote unquote, the tendency has always been to think that domestic issues needed to be taken care of before war issues. But the war issue, the war structure, is so fundamental to the way the ruling class rules that I think people on the left, and this relates to Medea Benjamin's talk and the whole thing, is fundamental towards really in terms of any agency in really challenging the ruling class. So that's a big thing to bite off, but I wanted to give it a shot. And this is not rehearsed. I knew about what you were going to say, but you didn't know what I was going to say. But
I think it's an important point, and it seems to me that at the risk of oversimplifying what is a difficult and serious question, what it means is how much hope can we have for progressive voices within the government. That was very specifically argued about this last week in regard to the case of Ocasio-Cortez,
yes.
This young woman who displaced a long-term congressman in New York, and the progressives in the Democratic Party, I hope you can hear the inverted commas, wildly clapped their hands saying, see, we're okay anyhow. We have someone who's saying nice stuff. in a congressional seat that she wasn't supposed to win. On the other hand, there are those who were quite cynical about what this was, that it was at best a sheep-herding enterprise, sheep-dogging enterprise, where Ocasio-Cortez represented an attempt to reincorporate those dissident progressives into the Democratic fold by saying, yes, there is somebody who looks like us near the top of the pyramid. I have to admit that I think that that latter view is correct, that the hesitations about Ocasio-Cortez, not up to and including hesitations about what she has actually said on issues like war, are well placed, and the time for celebration is not yet. The reason for it may be the sorts of things Polancis is suggesting. I'm not sure about that at all. All I know is that the millennium has not arrived with the election in New York 14.
It would be unseemly of me to be cynical or critical about Ocasio-Cortez basically accomplishing what I myself hoped to accomplish a few years ago by presenting a Sandersian sort of a left Keynesian point of view, or a leftist point of view, and certainly an anti-war point of view, and a stronger anti-war. I had anti-war first on my list, not last on my list, and it was really anti-war, where she was sort of putting it in different words. But the skepticism is from more than one quarter, Carl. It's like, okay, the left, there's your skepticism, but then there was the skepticism, or the kind of toning down, doing their own sheep herding from the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party, by sort of placing her victory in terms of what the demographic constitution of her district was, or what her age is. And I think there's some good articles on Jacobin, for sure, which are sort of a pro-Ocasio-Cortez point of view, like this is a good thing and this is hopeful. And I would support that, because if we're going to have agency, might as well act like we have agency.
Whether we do or not.
Yeah, right. But the point is, don't give up the agency before at least somebody else proves, okay, if somebody comes in and ties me up and hauls me off, fine, I don't have agency anymore. But the sort of cynical mainstream Democratic point of view was, on the one hand, oh, isn't this nice? She's bringing younger voters into the Democratic Party.
Right.
It's all about youth.
Step into the parlor.
And right. And so that was sort of very well critiqued at the Jacobin website. And so I'm taking a cautiously, I think what they're promoting is a cautiously optimistic point of view, and make our voices heard in races like this and races like others. And I would say that in relation also to the candidacy of Ben Jealous for governor of Maryland. I've never liked Ben Jealous. I didn't like him as head of the NAACP. In the Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, in the do we vote for Hillary Clinton or not, if I recall correctly, he was debating Cornel West on Amy Goodman's program, and he was, Ben Jealous wanted to keep people in the fold of the Democratic Party. I've never been really thrilled with his rhetoric, but he's being presented as a genuinely, progressive in the best sense of the word candidate, and we'll see what happens, in Maryland. There's a lot of balls in the air right now, and we should wait to see how they come down and have some say in how they come down.
We should make it clear, though, that you're not just jealous of Ben having run for office here.
Yeah, I'm jealous of everyone. As the letter to the editor, I'm jealous of Charles Krauthammer.
You've been discussed.
Green with envy. What a great! I love when people make puns on my name.
Yes. David is referring to a discussion in the letters column of the News Gazette. He had written a very good letter about the late Charles Krauthammer, and was taken to task on the principle of de mortuis nihil nisi bonum, although they didn't quite put it that way, of the dead speak only well. And the News Gazette has taken that up as its concern, I think, in this matter, rather than the more important concern, what's the late Krauthammer actually had to say about 15 years of war and more in the United States. None of it good.
He didn't really directly criticize me for speaking ill of the dead. I think I made it in my letter. I didn't say anything nasty about Krauthammer, alive or dead. And there are a lot nastier.
About his ideas.
Yeah, about his ideas,
Right.
and there are a lot nastier. I mean, there's actually a critique that was passed along to me subsequent to that, in which somebody was basically straightforwardly arguing that Charles Krauthammer got a pass because he spent the last 40 or 50 years of his life as a disabled person. He was given a pass. He was never criticized. I never really heard that before, but I don't. Anyway, I wasn't going to go there. And this person criticizing me, he didn't so much go. He went after me. He didn't so much criticize me. I was jealous. I'm not jealous of Charles Krauthammer, although I would like to be published in 400 newspapers. And there's a good Chomskyan reason why that's not going to happen.
Yeah, quite right.
So,
Quite right. I should also say that David and Ocasio-Cortez are not the only two people who have tried to be elected to Congress in this conversation.
Oh yeah, right.
in the dark backward and abysm of time, I ran for Congress as a Green from this district. It was actually a different district in those days, from this area in 2002, and came away thinking that the gerrymandered House of Representatives was so necessarily unrepresentative that the only cure was to elect representatives to the House of Representatives at large in a state and by party, so that if the Democrats get 10% of the vote in the congressional election, they get 10% of the representatives in Congress, which in Illinois now would be 7 representatives, I guess. Is that right? 70, 10%?
18, whatever.
We get 8, yeah. So
there's 18
they get
congresspersons.
1.8 representatives, and we have several 0.8 representatives,
Yeah.
so it wouldn't be hard at all.
Right,
but,
right.
But what that would mean was that 2%, that 10% of the electorate that voted Green would actually get perhaps a representative in Congress. The same would be true on a percentage basis for the representatives for the Republican Party and the Libertarians. This would seem to give a much more representative account of the political opinions in Illinois than the present single-member gerrymandered districts do. I don't see much possibility of that happening anytime soon, but when people talk about, well, it's time for election reform, it seems to me that's one of the things that should be on the table.
Yeah. But I want to bring us back, I want to pick your brain, if it's pickable, about where you're asserting this argument that Trump wants to do something and the ruling class isn't letting him doing it. Korea is a good example of that, and Russia as well with the upcoming, is it Helsinki summit?
Yeah.
And then we've got the Middle East, and then we've got China, and just to make the point, if it wasn't clear from the Miliband Poulantzas thing, Trump came in. The ruling class is used to having people in power who see the big picture, who see the big bourgeoisie picture. That's what Obama was good at. They have to offend some interests within the ruling class in order to maintain the interests of the entire ruling class. And the fascinating thing about Trump is he's come in and he's brought in people who sort of represent interest of the ruling class, that they're not all on the same page.
Well, that's true.
And they're getting, it's like it isn't so much that they're going to go against the interests of the ruling class, but they threaten not to represent the interests of, quote, the Marxist quote, all of the bourgeoisie. So how does that? I mean, how do you process that in relation to what Trump is up to in terms of his foreign policy?
I would first object just a bit to the notion that the issue is that, how did you put it, Trump wants to do something that he's not being let to do. I think far too much of the discussion has been about what Trump wants to do, what Trump's psychology is, why Trump wants to do what Trump wants to do, etc. I don't care. What is important is what his government does. What is important is what the presidential policies are, such as towards North Korea. We can argue about the psychology underlying it if you want, but that's far less important than what actually is being done. I mentioned earlier the Pilger's comment about why the CIA and the Pentagon and so forth didn't want Trump as president, and it was because he attacked the ongoing neoconservative policies that have dominated American government for 40 years, the war policies. He criticized them during the campaign. We forget that because there was so much nonsense around what Trump did and didn't say and the way he said it and so forth and so on, and how he combs his hair, quite literally, and all sorts of other issues, which neglected to notice that the reason that Trump is president is that he attacked the war policies and the economic policies of the last government. That's why people voted for him, and a significant percentage of the voters for Obama, for example, stayed home and didn't vote for Clinton, who was going to continue those same policies, economic and military. Trump is president as a result of the skepticism of the U.S. government policies, and here we go, or the state policies, if you like, in the language that David was using, that had been carried on for a while. The election was a rejection of that. Second point, that rejection is part of a general populist uprising that's going on around the world, an uprising that finally is not very well analyzed by our normal patterns of left and right. Have the Democrats moved too far right? Should the Democrats move a little further left and so on? This is not true. This is not the problem. This is not the issue. The Trump campaign and the Sanders campaign were both examples of this populist enthusiasm, an inchoate upwelling of objection to ruling class politics in this country, particularly in the area of war and economy. That same populist uprising is going on across the world, particularly in the U.S. and Europe, includes things like Brexit in England, Brexit in the UK, and the new Italian government, which tossed out both the equivalent of the Republican and Democrat parties in Italy and put together a government which, to American commentators, said, oh, an unholy alliance between far left and far right. That's not it at all. It's a populist uprising in Italy, like the populist uprising that produced the Sanders and Trump campaigns. And what Trump is doing in office is largely betraying the desires of the people who got him elected, largely betraying the economic and military policies that the people who got him elected wanted him to hold. But the establishment, the government, the deep state, the permanent government, is deathly afraid that Trump will act in accord with those principles that got him elected, and to some extent he has. That extent is represented by the Singapore and the Helsinki summits, and lights are burning late in Foggy Bottom tonight as the government, the state, tries to find some way to undermine the Putin-Trump meeting coming up in Iceland. There's all sorts of things on the table from the point of view of the permanent government, from war in Syria to economic questions, notably involving oil and elsewhere, that the permanent government is afraid Trump is going to tergiversate on, that the possibility of Trump's not staying with the program, not being down with the neolib and neocon program that the last administration followed, which his administration has followed all too closely so far. That possibility is keeping them awake at night. Good.
So, to put it in ironic terms, what we have when we open up our computers today and look at the Counterpunch website, what we have is people that we're supposed to like ragging on Trump. I mean, doing basically nothing but ragging on Trump, including foreign policy.
That's easier than...
Although some, I mean, over time, some of them have definitely supported his efforts to talk to Kim Jong-il and so forth. But still, we have the primary thing at Counterpunch, the leftist website, the sort of eclectic leftist website, is to demonize Trump. Whereas you look at the antiwar.com website and you find their primary writer, Justin Raimondo, saying clearly pretty much what you just said.
Yep.
A libertarian, anti-war libertarian, whose economic policies I don't agree with for 1 second,
Right.
but who seems to have, at least you would think, a pretty clear understanding of how the war party is trying to deal, what he calls the war party, is trying to deal with Trump. So you throw into that mix, and you get back to Miliband and get back to the British problem at that time was, what good is the Labour Party? Well, it seems like in the long run, Poulantzas wins this debate in terms of, Miliband was saying socialists have to work within what I think he was saying, if I'm correct, that the future is with the socialism within the Labour Party or within the political system, within the parliamentary system. And of course, what we got out of that over time was New Labour, was Blair Labour. Okay, but old Labour, socialist Labour, is coming back in the form of Jeremy Corbyn. And so probably there more than anywhere else, we have at least the specter, the possibility of a genuinely labor socialist government taking over a major country. So Miliband may end up, the agency of the left may end up triumphing, am I saying that? Winning
Yep.
in this context. But meanwhile, what do the people at you could say, well, what does that imply for Sanders? What does that imply for Ocasio-Cortez? But this is a question the left should be asking itself.
Well, I think that's right, and it seems to me that it's also correct to say that the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain raises these questions in a sort of distorting mirror for American politics. I mean, it's not a one-to-one correspondence in any way, but you're right to suggest the same questions are there. Whose side of the argument, as you've presented it, do you think the Corbyn phenomenon supports? Poulantzas or Miliband?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're sort of
you could make an argument either
their
way,
roots. Yeah, I mean, I think Jeremy Corbyn's roots is in those laborites, Tony Benn and people like
Sure,
that, who
exactly.
were more identified with the Miliband, sort of this practical, instrumental approach. Let's work within the system, so to speak. Whereas Poulantzas was saying, I mean, I don't think Poulantzas was being necessarily that dire. I think he was just being, realistic in a certain way by saying, you're up against some heavy structural forces here. In theoretical terms, they're called ideological state apparatuses or repressive state apparatuses. All this relates to this Marxist theorist, this French Marxist theorist named Louis Althusser. And anyway, it makes, I mean, it's a lens with which we can understand how the state works, but it isn't necessarily a lens which we can understand what there is to be done.
You're watching News from Neptune, and we're talking about state and government and looking at some comparative examples between the U.S. And Britain particularly, but in fact in the world at large. It raises a question that I've been writing about a little this week, various places, including that great political marketplace, Facebook. But that's the question, maybe 4th of July raised it too, I don't know, of the U.S. Constitution. Much effort has been exercised recently in pointing out that the warfare that the U.S. has been conducting throughout this century the warfare of the 21st century in the U.S. is unconstitutional, and it certainly is. It doesn't abide by the American Constitution. Barack Obama was the first American president actually to be at war through 2 consecutive presidential terms. That had never happened before. Even during the Second World War, even during the Civil War, that had not happened. The warfare that the U.S. has foisted upon the world in the last 15 years is literally unprecedented. Now, the question is, what does this have to do with the American state? The American Constitution defines the American state. We assume, we take that for granted. And that Constitution says that these wars are illegal, that the presidents have had no rights to continue to conduct these wars. It raises an interesting question of the sort that David's been talking about tonight regarding constitutionalism, regarding constitutions. The last representative, the previous representative in the House of Congressman from this district was part of a suit that sued Barack Obama for violating the Constitution by attacking Libya, that he had no constitutional right to do so. The suit didn't get very far, mainly because the courts said, we don't decide political questions, and that's a political question. Yeah, big deal. But the fact of the matter is that the Republican representative from this district, who has been replaced by a pale shadow of himself, was one of the bipartisan group that said, by the way, the government is acting unconstitutionally in killing people in Libya, which indeed it was, and continues to do. The question of Constitution, however, itself is a larger question, and since David has introduced it tonight, I thought perhaps I would say something about it. He's also introduced the old man in the British Museum, who wrote for the predecessor of the Herald Tribune in New York, and talked about politics in his day in a way not finally, I think, dissimilar to what we're trying to do here. Quote, "One of Marx's most striking insights was the observation that the various constitutions of the French republics," now remember, this is Marx writing in the middle of the 19th century, "and their imitations in other continental states were deliberately designed to obstruct progress towards genuine democracy." Most Americans say a constitution there establishes democracy. No, said Marx, if you looked at how constitutions work, they obstruct democracy. Though the French Revolution had introduced universal suffrage, everybody gets the vote, its significance was immediately undermined by the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the French document, and by constitutional structures that precluded the kind of social transformation that the Revolution's radicals wanted. Marx emphasized this repeatedly in his writings of the 1840s, and the failure of the revolutions of 1848 and the restoration of the constitutional orders in Europe after 1848 only confirmed his judgment. Accordingly, Marx felt only a total revolution would be able to overturn the bourgeois, liberal economic and political constitutions that stood in the way of substantive social change. That is, those constitutions there were meant to guarantee the rule of the bourgeoisie, what we would call the 1% today, the owners of the society. But here comes the turn. Hold on, because there's a roundabout here. Marx, and still more Engels, thought England was different. The House of Commons was unconstrained by the kind of constitutional apparatus seen on the continent, since Parliament was famously omnicompetent, that's the way to describe it, and the Lords and the monarchy were largely irrelevant. That is to say, there were not constitutional limitations on what the House of Commons could do. The UK has no constitution. The Commons are omnicompetent. They can make decisions on this law that we take to be already made by a constitution. Marx and Engels concluded that once the English working class got the vote, it would be able to use the House of Commons to achieve its political and economic goals peacefully. The accidents of history that had delivered this exceptional institution meant that revolution ought not to be necessary for the kind of social transformation Marx and Engels had in mind. Now, Point three. What happened? It didn't quite work out that way, but almost. After the Second World War, the English electorate rejected the Churchillian government that had brought the war on, rejected it out of hand, and put in power a labor government, a socialist government. And the first thing the socialist government did was to establish a national health service, health care for all beyond the wildest dreams of American liberals today, beyond the notion of Medicare for all, but a system that involved the confiscation of private hospitals and medical facilities throughout Britain so that every British citizen should have the right to medical treatment free of charge. This was what the socialist government, the labor government, after the Second World War did in Britain. The attempt of the later governments, up to and including particularly the current one in Britain, to roll that back have been to some extent successful, to destroy the National Health Service, to privatize the National Health Service, or to deny the services of the National Health Service to the community as a whole. That's an underlying issue, by the way, in the Corbyn campaign in Britain. And if this account is right, and I think it is, it also shows why some of the retrograde policies that exist in the United States are a result of the constitutional order not challenged by it. You're a witness.
Yeah. So your point, your major point from that is
Constitutions bite. That's the technical term we in the business use.
Yeah. Well, again, I wanted to getting back to the whole, what I was trying to get at, maybe in an obtuse way, is that Constitution, war powers, people feel helpless in relation to militarism. People feel helpless in relation to the military state. People think of the economy as separate from the state, when the economy is the state. I mean, the state encompasses the what we call the private enterprise or free enterprise or markets or whatever you have to say about it. The military is part of all of that. The military enforces that, as does the financial system, the Wall Street system, the whole thing. And within this context, what the Democratic Party tends to look for is reforms, and reforms in the weak sense of the word.
Exactly.
And that's what you worry about, whether it's Ocasio-Cortez or Sanders or Corbyn himself. And we have to be clear about what the difference is between these reforms and actually attacking some of really challenging some of the structural issues that Poulantzas was concerned about. And it seems like there's no more efficient way to challenge that structure is by challenging war, is by challenging militarism and war, because you've got it all there. You've got the ideology of it and the fear of it and all the patriotism, and you've got the economy that goes along with that. You've got the economic motives that go along with that, the spending that goes along with that, the kind of ironic kind of socialism you have in the military context for members of the military, which draws them in. There's all kinds of ways of looking at this, where to argue that that issues of militarism and war and foreign policy shouldn't be, and its relation to our relationships with the Middle East and Israel and its own militaristic issues. All of these point to this context as important as healthcare, as the issues that we talk about every week: education, healthcare, housing, and so forth. And there's more radical ways of looking at those issues as well.
I would like to point out, though, and I think finally it's important, that there's a big difference between the American liberal Democrats like Sanders and Warren of Massachusetts and Ocasio on the one hand, and the Corbyn phenomenon in Britain. There are similarities, yes, in the sense, in the way that I was arguing for them before, that both those democratic liberals, democratic progressives on the one hand, and the Corbynistas on the other, represent an outflowing of the populist sentiment. But that populist sentiment is a sentiment rather than a clear set of ideas, and whereas Corbyn is anti-military, there's no other way to describe it, the American examples aren't. As Bruce Dixon in the Black Agenda Report wrote this week, that with Sanders we have a socialist who's an imperialist, a military imperialist. Elizabeth Warren is the same way. There's much argument about this week about whether Ocasio-Cortez is too, but I think the answer finally is yes from the things that have been seen there. It's an American phenomenon, if you like, structural, Polancis-like perhaps, rather than a matter of agency, as David was arguing earlier. But what we have here is that these American progressives who are pro-war. And what Corbyn, one of the things Corbyn does well, is avoid that position on issues like the nuclear submarines that the British have, and more importantly, in terms of the military interventions which Britain has undertaken, usually at the behest of the U.S. Corbyn is light years separated from these American progressives. More power to him, and we need progressives in America who look more like him.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting phenomenon, though, that in the midst of all this, you have, ironically and maybe not intentionally in some ways, but you have ordinary people, ordinary liberal democratic people, I assume, among them, challenging the very existence of a major governmental agency, and that is ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. And that's kind of a big deal.
Yes, it is kind of a big deal.
And ironic, I mean, these are people that are they're not calling for the overthrow of the state. They're not calling for an end to all our wars, but they are calling for the end, not just the modification of, the end of, again, to use that phrase from Marxist theory, repressive state apparatus, RSA, which would be a pretty big deal. I mean, I don't know if they're realizing how radical that is in the context of challenging state power, because ICE is a pretty big part of sort of neoliberal state power. It's a product of various contradictions in the way neoliberalism is played out in terms of the movement of capital versus the movement of people and so forth. But it's a kind of a contradiction bubbling to the surface in a certain way that's kind of fascinating.
And the behavior of ICE is such a scandal that indeed it may be the basis upon which to build political initiatives that raise the questions about producing ICE in the first place. The freezer, so to speak, that had produced this vicious operation is an American attitude towards refugees that is unconscionable. We should open the borders. We should take in people who, in many cases, have been driven to come to the United States precisely because of vicious military actions by the United States or vicious economic actions like NAFTA, which has also been attacked by the current administration. These are the things that send people to the borders. The Obama-Clinton administration's support for the coup in Honduras produced a gangster state in Honduras that many people at the southern border of the United States are fleeing from. So it's American policy that has produced this problem in the first place, and it's American policy that has to change it. and that would include immigration reform, that is, accepting these people who come to the United States the way the Statue of Liberty says we're supposed to. The realization that the refugee crisis in Europe is a result also of American war making in the Middle East is the beginning of wisdom, and the solution is finally going to be stopping those wars in this hemisphere and in the Middle East, and recompense for the refugees. That's up to us, and we should be doing that. We're not even aware of the source of it, and that's what's going on.
Could I just, in the last minute or two that we have here, I'm loath to raise this issue, but since it's so gone to the forefront of what people are talking about, what civility is and what it isn't, what effective and appropriate incivility is or isn't. Is it interrupting people while they're having dinner in a public place? Is it, we're just curious what your take on this is in the last few days, if you care to have a take on it, or is it just liberal silliness that we're dealing with here? I think it's more than that, but I don't like the idea of whatever can be done back, whatever you do that can be done back to you in a way that is obvious, whether it's violence or disruption of various kinds, doesn't seem to be a good idea to me. It doesn't seem to be a good tactic to me. It doesn't seem to be a good thing to be spending our time talking about, as opposed to what is to be done about things like ICE and immigrant children and so forth. So that's my comment on it.
And if I understand you correctly, I think that's right. I think that this call for civility, the sort of thing that gets dissident scholars fired from the University of Illinois, is largely nonsense. If to repeat what I started with tonight from Rosa Luxemburg, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. I would point out also, though, in response to that, that Noam Chomsky has rightly criticized speaking truth to power.
Yes,
and Chomsky has said, first of all, power already knows what's going on. You don't have to. You're not telling them anything they don't know.
Yeah.
Secondly, it doesn't do any good because they're not going to change their ways because you speak truth to them. But there are a lot of people you should be speaking truth to, and that's your fellow citizens, and that's the ones that they're actually scared of at the pinnacles of power, the ones that are working very hard to make sure misunderstand the situation in a way that favors those at the pinnacles of power. So they're the people we should be talking truth to, and I hope we've done that tonight. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 27th week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. This has been a Eurasia or Their Asia edition.
We didn't hardly talk about Asia.
We hardly got there. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. We didn't get much to many of his important notes tonight either. Those will be posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, next week we'll be back with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.